So we are very close to the release of Poppy Playtime Chapter 2, which is perfect because not only am I completely out of ideas from Chapter 1, but there's also been basically nothing going on in the horror world right now, which is not really good for a horror gaming theory channel now, is it? But if all goes well, the chapter should be with us in about 2 weeks, but before then, we have one final tease from Mob Games. We have one video and a bunch of screenshots for the second chapter to keep us going for these last final weeks. So in today's video, I'm going to go over the commercial and the screenshots. I'm going to give you my opinions and my theories. I'm also going to go over some of the hidden details that are in them as well, and so we can discuss them together down in the comments. So first of all, just to recap the video if you haven't seen it, this is a Mommy Longlegs commercial. Now the majority of this video is made to look like a proper children's toy commercial. And in fact, when I was a kid, I remember a lot of these types of commercials, things like Super Soakers and stuff, and it really does seem quite authentic. But this is also tied into Chapter 1. So at the beginning of Chapter 1, we got this vintage Poppy Playtime commercial. Now, this is going to be the commercial that plays at the beginning of Chapter 2, which to me implies that every single chapter is going to begin with a commercial, which is good because these commercials all seem to have little hints and secrets to what's actually going on in the lore of the story. What's really interesting about this one though is that the entire time we can hear Poppy saying "wake up."
The new Mommy Longlegs from Playtime Co.
It starts off very faint, but she repeatedly says "wake up," sometimes in the left ear, sometimes in the right ear, and then right at the end we can see a close-up of her face where she says it once again, "wake up." Now, I think this relates to the death screens from Chapter 1. Whenever you die, you get a random death screen, which one of those was to "wake up," which I think is a confirmation that this text is Poppy talking to the player, which might be important for the theories. This also ties into my very first theory about this game, in which I talked about the possibility that you, the player or the protagonist, are yourselves a doll. After all, we can see multiple toys now that have consciousness. They can walk around, they can have conversations, and they can completely talk to you like they are alive, or were alive, or maybe still are alive. But either way, these people have the ability to walk around, they have the ability to make decisions and even converse. So there is absolutely nothing to say that we, the player ourselves, are also not a doll. And in fact, we don't know if we actually did get called back to the factory at all. This all could be part of one final experiment. We also get another close-up of this picture. Now this picture's been going around the internet for a little bit. I didn't actually make a video on this one because I've been busy with some other stuff. We'll talk about that another day. But this is a pretty interesting picture of Mommy Longlegs with a bunch of toys around the image. Now, one thing that I haven't particularly talked about yet, which I really want to talk about, is the claw on the left-hand side. Now, the more I see this claw, we first saw it in Chapter 1, it was one of the VHS tapes, and we now see it here, the more that I am absolutely convinced that this claw belongs to Experiment 1006. Now, one of my most controversial theories about the game was that Experiment 1006 isn't Huggy Wuggy. There seems to have been this assumption that Experiment 1006 is Huggy. In fact, it's one of the most common comments I used to get on my Poppy Playtime videos was, obviously Experiment 1006 is Huggy. But as I've said in previous videos, there's actually more evidence to suggest that Huggy isn't Experiment 1006. And I am absolutely convinced that this is the case. Now, hey, if we find out that Huggy is 1006, feel free to prove me wrong. But at this moment in time, I am convinced that 1006 was the cause of the downfall of this factory. We know that something weird is going on in this factory. For example, these toys should not be able to talk like this. They should not be able to have full conversations. That technology doesn't exist today, let alone back in the 90s or even earlier when Poppy was created. So there is no reason for these dolls to be able to have conversations. And I do think something went wrong, which is why all the staff members went missing. The scientist talks about Experiment 1006, which is a flaw in the scientific process, being missing. And I do think this claw is absolutely in reference to that. This is the only experiment that seems to be made completely of metal. Doesn't seem to look like a toy, not one that most children want to buy anyway. So I do think this is the failed experiment, and I do think this claw belongs to them. Now also on the other image, I don't know if you can actually see it in this because of YouTube's crappy compression, but in the other image you could see the words "make me a part of him." Now, I potentially think that could be a reference to Elliot Ludwig. At this moment, we don't really have anybody else that it could be in reference to. It could be in reference to Laith Pierre, but I think it's more likely to be in reference to Elliot Ludwig. And in fact, maybe I'll discuss this in another theory after chapter 2, it's entirely possible that Elliot Ludwig is experiment 1006. More on that another day though. So then the commercial carries on and it seems pretty normal aside from Poppy whispering wake up, until we get this hidden image, which I have looked over as much as I can, and I'm pretty convinced that this is one of the children in this image. It's just been distorted. It looks like a white mask. It looks very creepy, but if you look behind it, you can see the railing next to it. And if you look really hard, sometimes you can see the trees. So I'm pretty sure this is just a distorted version of this child's face, probably made just to make the video look a bit more creepy. Now, one other thing I want to point out here is actually, I think this is a big hint to what's going to happen in chapter 2. So we see this image, we see Mommy Longlegs, we see a physical version, but it also says do not expose elastic plastic to extreme heat or freezing temperatures. Now, if you also look at other parts of the commercial, you can see that Mommy Longlegs' arms and legs are made out of this material, elastic plastic. Now, this could be very similar to the grab pack technology. We don't know if it's exactly the same or a variation of it, but you can see that she can definitely stretch, and they make a big point of this in the commercial. And we're going to come on to that in a moment as well, because I think there might be a Mommy Longlegs reveal here. But if you look at this, the idea that elastic plastic shouldn't be exposed to extreme heat or freezing temperatures, I think that might just be a hint on how we're going to beat Mommy Longlegs in chapter 2, either using extreme heat or freezing cold. Probably heat, but you never know. So look out in chapter 2 to see if I'm correct on that one. Now, as I just said, I do think we actually can just about see a proper image of Mommy Longlegs. And when I say a proper image, I did say in my previous video that I thought Mommy Longlegs looked too nice, especially considering that Poppy seems to be very afraid of Mommy and warns us repeatedly about her. Now, if you freeze the video at this correct frame, you can see this image, which might just be distorted, but I truly do think this is Mommy Longlegs' real face. If you look at it, you can see two eyes, and you can see that it looks much more sinister to the Mommy Longlegs that we've already seen. So either this is a different Mommy Longlegs, perhaps a bigger one, or this is Mommy Longlegs' true face. And I said that in my previous video, I do think she's going to transform into a much more aggressive, a much more horrifying version, probably after we do something that she doesn't like. Another thing I want to point out as well, which actually ties into the screenshots that we're going to look at in a minute, is this very short sequence here. Now you can see this is the factory. We've seen these corridors before in chapter 1, but this time it seems to be incredibly dark, and whoever this is using a flashlight. Now I do think chapter 2 is going to introduce this element of darkness. Chapter 1 for the most part was very bright. There were no real dark scenes. Probably the darkest part was the vent chase, but even that was quite brightly lit. Now it does seem in chapter 2, which they've already said is going to be more scary, it seems like we're going to have the power go out. And I actually think that one of the objectives of chapter 2 is to get that power back on, and I have some more evidence for that when we look at the screenshots. But the final thing of note of this very short VHS commercial is the very end. We can see a very faint Poppy, which this is not actually the first time they've done this, by the way. They overlaid a very faint Poppy in one of the other commercials, but we can see this very faint Poppy which gets a little bit more clear until she finally says, "Wake up." Now, as I've said, Poppy has said this multiple times now, and I really do think she's talking to the protagonist about this, which could be more evidence to the fact that we aren't awake in some capacity. Perhaps again, we are a doll, we are a toy, and we haven't fully awakened. Or maybe something between chapter 1 and chapter 2 knocks us out. I'm not entirely sure. It's going to be very interesting to see what she means by wake up. Now, one last final hidden detail in this commercial is this very hard to spot but very short sequence. Now, it's definitely in the factory and it looks like it is a very dark area, and we can also possibly see some Mommy Longlegs webbing on the right hand side. But as you can see, this person walking through very slowly sees this dark area and then very quickly and suddenly looks up, which is something that I think Mommy Longlegs is going to do in chapter 2. I do think she's going to come at us from all angles. It seems like she can crawl along the walls like a spider, so she can probably come from any angle, which is going to make some of the scenes potentially more tense. Now, alongside this video, we also have some screenshots from the Discord. Now, a lot of these are just pretty looking art assets, I guess, but also some of them have some little clues. Now, the first one is the train. We've seen this train before, but if you look at that in conjunction with the third screenshot, which is the train tracks, I actually think we're going to get on this train. I think this is going to be a sequence where we get on the train and probably have to fend off attacks from Mommy Longlegs or somebody else. That would be very interesting. Either that, or we're going to have to try and return power to the train to get to the next area, possibly into chapter 3. Now the second screenshot shows this corridor very similar to all the other corridors we've been in, except this one looks completely destroyed. You can see along the sides of the walls that the walls are crumbling away, the floor has completely gone, which is possibly due to the idea that the factory has been abandoned for over 10 years, but it also could mean something else. It could mean that there's something below the factory, maybe even a hole of a level that most of the workers weren't aware of. After all, it does seem a little bit strange that all these experiments were going on. They had to have been happening in secret, because if every single member of staff knew about it, somebody surely would go to the authorities. So there's probably a whole secret area of the factory, and this could be proving that it's actually underneath the factory. That also could tie in to the staircase to hell idea. To hell in this case being to the underneath of the factory where all of the horrible experiments were going on. We have yet another one of these corridors with a small cardboard cutout of Kissy Missy, which is interesting. I definitely think Kissy Missy is going to show up at some point in the game, probably not in chapter 2, but at some point she's probably going to show up. Maybe out for revenge after what we did to Huggy Wuggy, not too sure. We then have this image, which I think is showing one of the puzzles from chapter 2, but if you look on the left hand side, you can see the TV, which I think is pretty much confirming that we're going to have more VHS tapes to find in chapter 2, which is good because the chapter 1 VHS tapes were pretty much the only thing that gave us any lore, so I'm looking forward to finding out more of those. And in fact, if you look very closely at the console, you can see another turquoise VHS tape just there, so I'm pretty sure this is confirming that we're going to be finding more VHS tapes. Now this one is very, very interesting. This is the Poppy area from chapter 1. It looks a little bit more dark and a little bit more realistic this time. But the most interesting thing about this picture, we can first of all see that Poppy is missing. Of course, we let her out. But secondly, we can see that this cupboard is pushed to its side. Now in chapter 1, this was stood upright and it was blocking this weird door that was here. Now in this image, it's been knocked over. So either somebody's moved that out of the way or somebody got angry and knocked it over. Either way, somebody's definitely been in this area, and I don't think it's Poppy. I don't think Poppy's strong enough. It possibly could be Mommy Longlegs, or it could be somebody else. Maybe even Experiment 1006. We then get this image, which I think is just showing us that we are going to be swinging. We know that the grab pack hands are going to have multiple functions. In chapter 2, there's going to be more puzzles, different types of puzzles, and we know that we are going to be swinging, so great, Spider-Man, I guess. We also have a picture of a vent, which is, well, it's just a vent, although this one is much more claustrophobic than in chapter 1, and it definitely looks a bit more dark and eerie to me, which is also very interesting, because if you watched my playthrough of, was it Floppy Playtime? Whatever the Roblox ripoff was, that actually had a different vent scene in chapter 1, which was kind of interesting. I quite liked it actually, so I don't know if this is going to be another sort of one of those scenarios. We're going to be chased in a vent again, who knows? The next one is looks like a really secret area of the factory. I mean, there's these shutters here that you can't get through, and there is this little air vent here, which is probably how we're going to get into this area. And you can notice that it's very, very dark, and I think this again is the idea that we're going to have to be returning power to this area, probably to turn the lights on, but also probably to get that train going. And then finally, we have yet another corridor. This one is odd because it has a TV in the corner at the end, which may be used to play commercials for customers or for visitors, I'm not sure. But this one's in a very different color palette, and this, I think, is a hint to the caterpillar creature that we saw in the trailer for chapter 2. Now that creature kind of came out of nowhere and it seemed to be chasing the protagonist, and yeah, I think that's going to be one of the main enemies, kind of like how Huggy was in chapter 1. It's interesting that we're now seeing this other area of the factory. I'm not sure what wing this is from, but if I had to guess, I would say maybe the dining hall area. After all, we know that caterpillars can get very, very hungry. So maybe that's a little in-joke there. I'm not too sure. But those are the updates that we have. There are some things that we can start to get excited about chapter 2, which, like I say, should be here in a couple of weeks. Just on that note, if you are a big fan of Poppy Playtime, I know the channel has been very, very, very quiet lately. I just haven't had anything to talk about with Poppy Playtime, nothing interesting, and there hasn't really been any games out lately that have been really that interesting. I've just been playing Elden Ring, and I made one Elden Ring video. Not as many of you seem to be interested in that video, which is totally fine. I've not really had much else to do, so as soon as chapter 2 comes out, I promise you the videos will pick up. We will have plenty and plenty of videos theorizing over chapter 2 and doing all that kind of stuff. But there we go. Hope you did enjoy the vid. If you did, let me know down in the comments below. Leave the video a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Like I say, plenty of Poppy Playtime theories on the way. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.